fraud's become kind of pervasive in our environment these days. It's a real challenge, and it really should demand everybody's attention. It's super important. The good news, though, I think many people and organizations are really standing up and addressing the problem. I can't tell you the number of times in the past I've gone to organizations, mainly auto lenders, I will say, and I've actually said, hey, can we talk? And they'd be like, there's no fraud in my book. What are you guys talking about? Nothing in my book. My favorite line actually was somebody once said, hey, what I do is I bring the guys into the dealership and I look them in the eye. So, no, that's pretty cool. Not a single one of those people, though, could explain why their provision for credit loss was going haywire, but they guarantee they had no fraud. So that's pretty funny. First-party fraud, I think, in our environment is the one that we think about a lot. Misrepresentation of income, employment, that kind of stuff happens a lot. I think, based on our data, around 60% of fraud that we see in that in the auto space is related to first-party fraud. So that's an interesting one. But over recent years, we've actually seen an increase in third-party fraud, which is kind of what you associate with organized crime gangs. Just another anecdote: a neighbor in on my street had their car stolen the other day. They actually pushed his wife's car out of the way so they could get to the car they wanted. And they were in and out in about 90 seconds, which is fascinating. Now, it was a Land Rover, so I was actually surprised it was that slow, because, they're not good. But it's, we've all heard that story, though, right? We've actually seen that people can get into cars, it's on a container truck, it's at Port of Montreal, and it's out before you can do anything. And they do that because there's a lot of money in it. Vehicles today are valuable assets. They really are. And with the frameworks that fraudsters have put in place, they're actually becoming more liquid. You can get them out into a different country very quick. For most people, that's where the story stops, or that's where they think the story stops. What's happening more and more is the money from those sales are actually coming back into Canada. We're seen as a haven for financial crime and money laundering. It's an enormous problem, and Jen, I'm glad Jen is here to talk to us a little bit about that. Once it's here, it flows around a number of accounts, and then it's back out. Why? Because it's funding other types of organized crime, whether that's human trafficking, drugs, guns, just things that we don't want. And so we really need to think about that, not just the immediate issue that we see, but the burden that fraud places across our entire environment. So that's my little soapbox. I'd like to just say thank you, obviously, to our panelists. We're actually going to explore some of the fraud that we've seen in 2024, what we're thinking about in 25. And I think Liliane mentioned earlier that we might be seeing some AML KYC. I think absolutely right. That's definitely coming. So we really need to think about that and what we can do to protect ourselves. So I'd like to jump right in from there. Actually, firstly, I'm going to pass over to Victoria Bowes, Detective Constable at Halton Region. Thank you so much for joining us, and you're going to give us a bit of a law enforcement view.
Yeah, I sure am. Thank you. Everybody can hear me okay? So I just want to give you an overview of what fraud is looking like in 2025 right now. Long and the short of it is that it's booming. It's going to continue to grow at an exponential rate. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, so in Halton Region alone, we're a relatively mid-sized service. We police a demographic of about 600,000 people, but it is relatively upper to upper middle class. We do have a lot of money in the region. We had over 2,900 reported frauds last year. And I want to emphasize reported because we all know that there's a significant issue with underreporting and frauds as well. So the true number of that is actually going to be much larger. So fraud is a massive issue, and it is largely because it is such low risk for potentially high reward. And I know that we are here at the auto conference, so I want to speak specifically just on auto fraud and vehicle fraud financing. And if you look on the screens here, you're actually going to see some photos of seizures that we've made during search warrants in relation to auto fraud and vehicle fraud financing. And our last two major projects, Project Lux and Project Buff, did revolve around this. And a large piece of vehicle fraud relies on identity theft and identity fraud as well. So that is where the fraudsters are relying on the use of PII, or victim personal identifying information, in order to create counterfeit documents that could then be used for lending opportunities and applications in order to fraudulently obtain cars. And if you look at the photos here, here. I know it's going to be difficult to see, but it's the same face on every one of those driver's licenses. It's just a different name. Unfortunately, I have had to redact out the names on them because they are genuine people. But you can see they have matching birth certificates and driver's licenses, and this is what the fraudsters were using in order to go into the dealership and fraud obtain those vehicles. And that top left photo there, that's actually a Ziploc bag of about 200 IDs, all the same guy's face on them, but that was hidden in, it was a speaker vent in one of our search warrants that we found. So.
Just a quick question. Do you see the quality of the fraudulent driver's license improving?
It depends on the counterfeiter that's involved. So we've seen every level of sophistication when it comes to the counterfeiters. Some are a bit more rudimentary, so they might not be passing all of the inspection when it comes to the fraud detection. Some of them are much better. So in this case, a lot of these were really well done. You can see they had the holographic trillium on them. The photo overlay is pretty good. It had the micro printing along the side of the photo. So they were pretty successful in getting, I believe it was over $200,000 in money from different financial institutions, telcos, and vehicle dealerships as well. And then if you look at the bottom left photo, this is just an example of some of the card stock that's being used by counterfeiters to manufacture those counterfeit driver's licenses right now. So that's the very beginning of the counterfeit manufacturing. And these photos here are examples of the equipment that's being used to manufacture these documents. It is not sophisticated. You can buy all of this stuff at Staples or at Amazon. So you've got your heat laminators, your cutters, your different color printers, your card printers. The only thing that might be a little bit difficult to get your hands on there are, you can see the yellow sheet of paper. That's actually the trillium overlay that's used in the driver's licenses. But in this case, this was the most sophisticated counterfeit lab that we had taken down in Halton police history, and it was all inside of a 600 square foot condo, really not far from here. So you don't need a lot. You just need to know exactly what the security features are on each of the identification cards that you're looking to manufacture. And this is the payout for fraud. So this was located in our counterfeiter's residence. So $177,000 in bulk currency as well as gold bars. And a lot of this was being laundered through some different avenues. But like I said, just a huge payout. And it goes back to fraud is now a massive trend because it's low risk, very high reward, and we're also seeing a massive transition in the types of people that are committing fraud now. People who have traditionally engaged in violent crime, your carjackings and your robberies, who are now switching to fraud because it gives them that sense of anonymity, and they really have a lot less risk when it comes to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree with that point completely. It's almost like we've seen a democratization of fraud. Like it used to be many years ago that it was very tough for people to do. You had to be fairly well funded by specialist equipment. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's true anymore.
No.
I really don't think it is.
No, definitely not. And even the availability of PII online now to access it, buy it, and sell it, you really don't need a lot. You just need a web browser. Gone are the days where you had to use these very sophisticated measures to get onto some dark web marketplace and buy it. Now it's much easier to do, and it is extremely, extremely cheap. You can buy hundreds of identities for a little under $25 right now. So it's just on the fraudster to sort through credit scoring, employment status, and exactly what they would need in order to manufacture that identity.
Yeah, I want to come to John. I have a few questions for John, but just another anecdote. A few years ago, I was talking to a gentleman who had actually given his 12-year-old daughter a challenge if she could earn some money, and that was to go online and get to the point where basically she could buy a fake ID with her image but different credentials and a different age. You had to stop her after like 13 minutes or something like that because she was ready to go. So it is really, really easy. John, thank you for being here. I'm interested. So we've seen a lot of what happens on the front lines, and obviously there's a huge amount of value that comes with something like that. From a lender at Scotiabank, how do you see fraud impacting your operations specifically?
Yeah, look, first of all, I feel a lot feel a lot worse about our fraud security after seeing these first couple slides and hearing the fake IDs for $25. That doesn't feel great. Look, obviously for us as a big lender in the space, fraud's a big concern, and so we've taken a number of steps to kind of mitigate it. Mind you, I would also point out we're the captive for Jaguar Land Rover, so that was probably our Land Rover there that got stolen out of your friend's driveway in 4 minutes. But we've set it up like layers of defense is how we look at fraud. So one of the things we did is we brought a lot of our fraud teams in-house. So we have a security and investigations team that deals with law enforcement and border security. We brought that group into our auto business, and we've consolidated them with our non-prime fraud team. And you don't get a lot of true name fraud in non-prime, but you do get a lot of you do get a lot of misrepresentation. And so we consolidated those two teams into our head office. For some of our brands, like JLR, for example, we've put scanners in, ID scanners, and we did that back in 2019, physical scanners to test driver's licenses. Of course, we search fraud databases and things like that. So really for us, it was setting up layers of defense, but despite all of that, we do see our fraud losses continuing to increase. So it still remains a big problem both on the credit loss side. So I think there's still a lot of work we can do to improve on it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's super interesting. Actually, I did buy a Land Rover once. It was fine. There's, I always found it interesting, especially in this model, about where that kind of, where the ownership should sit in terms of that fraud detection. Because I agree. I mean, we have a lot of lenders who we work with in terms of fraud prevention and detection. But, increasingly you have to do more work at the dealer level. So I'm interested, like, any thoughts in and around that? Like, what should or could dealers be thinking about in, like, the physical scan is really great. I worry about the quality of the thing. But are the things you talk to your dealerships about in terms of what they should do to look for and prevent fraud?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple things I would say. The scanners were good at the time. I think there's a lot of new technologies that are better and more sophisticated, and so we're exploring new partnerships. I think there's a number of ways we can approach it. One is partnerships on the technology side that dealers will require them to implement. It's easier to do where we have an exclusive relationship and we're the primary finance source. It's easier for a captive like Scott's shop to implement something like that. It's more difficult where we're semi-exclusive and we're competing against other banks. And that's where I think there needs to be broader industry solutions. And I know everyone hears, or maybe you've not heard, but you hear the phrase "dealers will take the path of least resistance," and so people are afraid to implement any kind of friction into the space. But when it comes to fraud, we shouldn't be looking at fraud prevention as friction. It really does need to be an industry standard that we implement, and I think we need the help of some of our partners, and whether that's portals who are coming up with solutions, but that's a place I think is a real opportunity, and then we can implement it across the entire network. It's bad for our reputation. It's bad for consumers. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. The one thing I think I've seen in a bit of a change of sentiment over the last few years is no longer thinking about fraud as a competitive advantage. We say this a lot. There used to be a time where I didn't really care if the guy on the other side had all the fraud and I didn't. I think now there's a realization that eventually it will come back to me. And so I love the idea of making sure that we have an industry standard, and even more so, making sure that we're working together, because ultimately, however we think about this, the people who pay are Canadians, whether that be increased prices or whatever that may be. That's where the burden typically lands.
I couldn't agree more. Ultimately, it comes through in pricing, and so it's credit loss for us or fraud loss. But whether it's our OPEX or credit loss, it's pricing to the consumer at the end of the day. So yeah,
I'd like to pass it over to Jen now, actually. So again, we've heard some of the challenges we see from a dealership side. Obviously, the huge amount of money that's coming in and out of the system. We've talked about money laundering being a big problem in Canada. How big is it, and should we care?
Should we care? You should care. I was going to say most financial crime in some way is actually interconnected. Your point about organized crime is a good one. Money that is fraudulently acquired and then cleaned through legitimate banking systems runs to a tune somewhere, depending on who you ask, about $50 to $100 billion in Canada alone. That's why we've developed this fabulous reputation as being snow washers. Not great, not what we're looking for from an international perspective. Something that will impact this audience directly. This is the year that Canada gets examined by a global regulator about the strength of our program. There's a good chance we're going to be found wanting in that category. That has really dramatic effects on us as a nation in total, including our general productivity as a nation. So these are big ticket items that are coming up. So our regulator, if we think about FinTrack and its, I guess it's new oversight coming in the fall, I think, for automotive specifically or for leasing, there's a really good business case to be made as to why our regulator is going to be a little more aggressive than perhaps they have been in the past. There used to be something called leniency. The big 5 banks are very familiar with this concept. I don't see that being extended to the banks, and I don't think it's going to be extended to our friends in mortgages. I don't think we're going to see it extended to this category either.
Yeah, I agree. And just your point about mortgages, we've seen that the mortgage brokers specifically were or came into the crosshairs in October last year, and you can already see FinTrack is looking at them. And I remember talking to somebody, their question was, hey, well, the lenders are doing it, like the actual mortgage underwriter is doing it, why do I need to do it as well? FinTrack were like,
yeah, and generally the rule of thumb is if you own the customer, you own the risk. So some of this accountability falls on you, depending on what your role is in that particular ecosystem. So it will be a fairly dramatic shift. I think what we saw in mortgages is people waiting right up until the deadline to see if they had to do anything, thinking maybe this isn't real, and then October 11th we crossed the line and then all hell broke loose. We saw that in our business. So Minerva is an anti-financial crime risk assessment platform for individuals and entities. That's what we do. And we partner with Equifax to do much of this work. It was like a mad rush through the door on October 12th when organizations realized that those moves were for real and not just posturing. It was pretty interesting. So I would urge you, don't do that. Don't.
I was actually gonna, maybe we could riff on that a little bit. Like, what advice would you give this sector specifically? Like, believing that, say, around that same time that we might see those same regulations come in and affect, they already affect some of the sort of retail banks who do lending, but some of the other parties in this space. What advice would you give in terms of standing up an AML program?
How do I say this? The regulations are not hard to understand. They're literally written in black and white, and they're incredibly descriptive about what it is that you need to be doing in your space. Don't wait, just get organized. It doesn't need to be a big effort or drama or cost for your organization. I think being thoughtful about where the risk lies in your organization and how you think you're going to manage that going forward and having a plan for it is a really great idea. And I'll give you a super concrete example. So Equifax and Minerva have a client that we share in common, FAF, leasing. When we first started talking to them, they said, we'd like to do like a little POC, right? A proof of concept. We're going to do a look back on some of our previous issues. What they realized in a look-back scenario was they wouldn't have lost a very, very expensive car that was immediately shipped overseas and driven off their lot into a container and gone if they had just conducted an adverse media search. That wouldn't have been a thing, right? Now we have a case study with FAF looking into what were the benefits for their business. So not only does it lower their potential losses that they would have suffered, but it also speeds up the entire process, I think by their estimate, this is what I'm looking at here, by about 66%. So all of that manual work, all of the back and forth can be automated. You can do that work really quickly, really cleanly, and know exactly who it is you're about to do business with and whether it makes sense to beef up your program if you have one or get one if you don't.
Perfect, thank you. So just maybe I can bring it back to Victoria, if that's okay. I'm kind of the one thing I do like to talk about a little bit here is advice, and what can people or businesses or organizations do. Anything from a law enforcement perspective that you would offer as advice to the group here?
Yeah, so there's a few things that come up consistently when we're running our investigations. I would say Communication is huge. As I had mentioned previously, underreporting is a massive issue in fraud. So please, if you feel that there is an instance where you may be the victim of a fraud, or if you are the victim of a fraud, engage local law enforcement, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to get a handle on this and mitigate any future victimization as well. Partnerships are also going to be huge in 2025. We from law enforcement realize that historically we have not been good with information sharing. We tend to squirrel it away, but we have come to the realization that if we're going to get ahead of this, which is going to be very difficult, we're going to need to engage external partners as well. So, and this goes for our lenders too. ID verification services are going to be huge. Obviously, biometrics are going to help. It's not going to get rid of fraud altogether, but it is definitely going to help in mitigating it. KYCs, please, please, please. If I can harp on one thing, it is just do your simple due diligence checks. In the case of Lux and in Project Buff as well, that was the downfall of a lot of service providers, is they were pressured by the fraudsters and they just wanted to get the deal done. So if any sort of proper KYCs had been done, that would have axed it right away. And finally, the last thing and the most important thing, it is not complicated. I would just say trust your gut. If it does not feel right, it generally is not. So trust yourself and your intuition.
Yeah, it's super surprising how many times we speak to somebody after the fraud has happened and someone says, yeah, I wasn't sure that was right, but someone said it was okay, so we did it anyway. Just on your point about law enforcement and sharing, I do want to, we do a lot of work with RCMP. And I know they're bringing out a national fraud reporting system. I think I've got that right. There's an acronym around it. So I think that's important as well. It's more directed, I think, at consumers. But, I almost feel bad. RCMP talk about fraud losses in about $500 million, like $560 million. I mean, that is a fraction of what's happening in Canada today. And on one hand, we need to make sure that we're investing and having the ability for people to report that, because I think it's way underreported today.
So I just want to go back on that. The the best way to think about how do you control those kinds of losses, whether it's a national scale or your business alone, is at your front door. The moment that you are the most vulnerable is the moment that you first engage with a customer that you don't know. And that is true pretty much across the board for every business. KYC and identity verification is not the same thing as an AML check. Those are also things that you need to understand. They're different standards, and they collect different types of data to, one, validate that a person is real, who they say they are, preferably alive. That happens a lot. And then there is the AML component, which is understanding their context, who they are in the world. You today could do yourself a huge favor, and the due diligence that Victoria's speaking of is really important. Get a sense of who they are in the world. Take a look at their socials. Look at adverse media. What have they done before? If there's an existing fraud charge, it's probably not the client for you.
Perfect advice. John, I'm going to ask you the crystal ball question. So, from a lender perspective, what kind of keeps you awake at night for 25?
Well, I live in Halton, so I'll probably be kept awake at night after hearing those crime stats. So from a lender perspective, I think there's a couple things. The challenge we have in this indirect model is you're highly reliant upon the third-party dealer to do a lot of the verification for you. So I think the reality is they're just not going to do those steps at the level that we're required unless we force them. And so whether it's technology solutions, minimum standards, I think that's something we need to talk about. The other thing that I'm always fearful of, and when we look at fraud quite broadly, whether it's a bust out situation, is demanding more of some of our partners. And nothing probably frustrates me more than finding out we were the fifth deal to get funded on a bust out. That went all through probably the same portal, and it's one thing that maybe doesn't keep me up at night, makes me want to flip my desk over when I see those losses, and that's something that we can get help from some of our partners. There's no reason that someone should pick up a Volvo from us, and then fund an Infinity from Scott 3 hours later or a day later, and then make their way to the other lenders. And so we just need better cooperation, better support from some of our partners, and set some standards. So
perfect. I would echo that. I did just want to touch, as you mentioned about that kind of thing. I always remember a story. Actually, it was from Ryan, a colleague of ours, who would actually, doing that same kind of thing, they would find a fraud where someone had funded 3 different deals at 3 different manufacturers, and at that time the police officer would actually go to the dealership and said, hey, this is a fraud, the car left your lot a month or so ago, and the message they got back was, but they're still paying. It's like, okay, but it might go bad in a couple of months, but they're still paying, so they couldn't do anything at that point. And so I think we also have to think about like what does that mean? And I think as we start thinking about some of the more stringent AML KYC practices, I think there's a bit of interesting stuff there. That was the questions. I know we have a few minutes left, but I did just want to take a moment just to underscore some of the key things that we talked about today. And the one thing I really want to underscore to everybody here is that as we approach fraud and we think about tackling it, it isn't just going to be law enforcement. That's not really a way we can get out around it. It's not going to be any individual organization. In fact, the only way we fix this is like being Team Canada, essentially. Everybody here has a piece of the most complex jigsaw puzzle we've ever seen. And the only way we're going to be able to take the fight back to the bad guys is to come together, work collaboratively and collectively with partners and together to combat this crime. That's it.